So one of the other pieces that struck me when I was in Arctic Bay was the fact that the Anglican Church was so deeply embedded in the community, so deeply part of the life of the community. There were certain people and some people who did not participate, and there was good reasons for that. But for the most part, it was integral part of everyday life in Arctic Bay. Reading the Bible every day, and one of the big problems I ran into was there was a scripture portion to be read every day, and people would read it and then they'd ask me what I thought about it. Well, I I had to start reading it on a daily basis, and because it was in Inuktitut, I had no idea what it was saying. So then I had to go look it up in English, and read it in English, and then try and work out what the Inuktitut was saying around the English. Um, it was an incredible part of the daily life, and yet I knew that there'd be no missionary present for a very long time. And it struck me, okay, how can this be so deeply ingrained? It's totally run by the Inuit. This is their show. They're preaching. They're running the church. They're doing everything here. How could this be, given the kind of sort of history of colonialism, the history of missionaries that I sort of generally understood in anthropology? That question lay relatively dormant, but it did come up. It became quite strong in the spring of 1981, when for the first time a group of, well, not a group, but a pair of Pentecostal preachers came from Pond Inlet to Arctic Bay and began leading prayer services in Arctic Bay. Again, this is entirely within an Inuit context. And as often happened with the first appearance of the Pentecostals, you got all kinds of disruption, all kinds of dispute, argument. I remember Arnaud Yumiak, my good friend Arnaud Yumiak, going along one time to the Pentecostal meeting, and I asked him afterwards, well, what was it like? He said, those people are making a mistake. I said, well, what mistake are they making? He said, they keep going, atata, father, father. And he said, but Chris, it's atata kilami tutit, our Father in heaven. Atata vut kilami tutit, in heaven, because you have to point to which father you're talking to. If you just say father, you could be talking to the other father down below there. I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting argument. I remember one day, one of the women in town, her three daughters had become very active participants in this small emerging Pentecostal group, and I remember her standing up in front of the church one Sunday and basically just condemning her daughters and saying she wanted nothing to do with this or nothing to do with what they were doing. So it was quite divisive. But the other thing that happened that came out in the disputes, debates around that, is that there was a reference to something that happened before. And it took me a little while to catch this reference and then to sort of gently prod into the reference, because obviously it was pretty sensitive. And it turned out to be a series of events that took place in 1946, where a woman called Ikumak had gone up to heaven, visited with Jesus and some dead people in heaven, and then came back down and had a whole series of rules, regulations, proclamations for people to do and for people not to do. Clearly this had caused quite a stir in Admiralty Inlet at the time. Everybody I spoke to, everybody said that everybody else's parents were involved in it, but not their own. And after you go around, you realize, well, wait a minute, that means everybody's involved in it. I remember, again, Arnaud Yumiak telling me, he was about 15 at the time, I think. He told me that they were camped at a place called Iqalulik, and his parents, Kungasrito Kupak, went down to where Ikumak was to find out what was going on, and left him as a 15-year-old basically in charge of his younger brothers and sisters in this camp. It turned out to be for about 2 weeks, is what he said. So this is clearly a big thing that was going on. The folks in Arctic Bay were not happy talking about this, but the appearance of the Pentecostals brought back all of those things, and it led to a lot of discussion around it. Now, the movement in 1946 was eventually kind of quelled because two of the Inuit went and told Jack Turner, the missionary at the time. This is before Jack Turner dies. Two of the Inuit went and told Jack Turner about this, and Jack Turner wrote a circular letter to the Inuit, which was distributed throughout the area, basically putting down all these events and then gradually suppressing it. There was an RCMP investigation. There was quite a bit happened around it, but that told me that there was more to this history than I knew. In working out my doctoral thesis and those pieces, all of that stuff got put aside, and I eventually came to a point where I wanted to write up those events in the spring of 1981, and so I thought, okay, I'll get all my notes and stuff out, the bits and pieces that I've got from the archives, and I'll see what kind of sense I can make out of this thing. So I was starting to write that, and I needed to write an introduction which sort of gave a background history of missions on North Baffin Island. I thought, well, I'll just go look it up in the library. Somebody's got to have written about this. I'll just go look it up in the library, and hey, there we go, right? Yeah, there was no such thing. Nobody had ever done any work on it. Nobody had ever written about it at that point. And I'm like, oh, this means that from whatever I've got to patch together a history of what happened here. And of course, as I began to do the research, and Frédéric certainly knows far more about that now than I do, but as I began to do the research, things got stranger and stranger and stranger, to put it mildly. I realized that there was a story here that I could only sketch out in an outline that was so totally radically different from the way I had even thought about the history of missions that it was quite mind-blowing. And so in trying to write the introduction to the article on the events of 1981 and 1947, I ended up writing an article called "Mission and Opposition in North Baffin Island," which really was, I think, the first attempt to try and get at the history of what had happened in North Baffin Island. I'm much amused by the fact that somebody at Cambridge University thought it was thought enough of the article that they wrote an entire master's thesis attacking it and undermining it. I thought this was just an article that I kind of knocked off because I needed to have some background information, and I wasn't particularly committed to it theoretically or anything. It's just I needed to know what had happened. Anyways, there's an entire master's thesis on that article at Cambridge University. But what came out of that article, which I think was really, really important, was that in the early stages, in the stuff that we came later to know as the Siqituk stuff, but in the early stages, Christianity had spread into North Baffin through the aegis of other Inuit largely, and also through the distribution of, actually it was the Gospels and a version of the Anglican prayer book. And through the whalers just handing this stuff out. People had learned to read. It was one of those interesting things. The syllabic system had been taught by the missionaries on South Baffin Island, and then the Inuit themselves taught it from one camp to the next, all the way up. So that in fact, the people in Arctic Bay told me that the syllabic writing system was an Inuit invention, that this was their own writing system, that they had invented it, because in Arctic Bay, they had learned it from other Inuit. So it was an Inuit writing system. That's all there was to it. And so they could read and write these texts. But, I at that point, and I realized that, okay, these folks are sitting reading and writing, or no, they're reading the Gospels. And so I sat down and I just sat down one night, I just read through the 4 Gospels. Like, what are they reading when they read this thing? And I think, well, all these images of these agricultural images of sheep and goats and wheat and tares and winnowing, and then kings and priests, and like, it doesn't matter how you do the translation. This just is not going to make sense to some guy who spent his life hunting seals. Wine, all of that stuff. Like, what were these guys making sense of this thing? And it just puzzled me so much. It still puzzles me, but the only way we have of getting at that is sort of through the actions that happened. The whole series of events around Umik, which are described in the historical record, and since then Frédéric has gone on and really recorded the stories around that. But the realization that the Inuit had, for whatever reasons, and this is still my question to this day, for whatever reasons, had grabbed onto this thing. They had taught themselves, and the Siklitip stuff is a conversion. It's their own, we have to be really careful with the word conversion here, but it's their own becoming a Christian process. And they had taken themselves through this. And so, 10 years before the missionaries show up, before the Anglican Catholics showed up together, 10 years before, these guys had already worked this thing out in their own way. And it struck me, even in writing that history, that really, first of all, the Inuit were only interested in the missionaries because they realized that there was stuff in here that they didn't understand. I mean, sheep and goats, what the hell's that all about? And so they needed somebody to teach them that, to help them understand that. But my reading of it was, well, they were really not interested in the missionaries taking over this show. They were really interested in running, let's call it, an Inuit Christianity. And they needed information to make this thing go forward. And the only way to get that was from missionaries. Unfortunately, that's not how the missionaries saw it. They saw it quite differently. But it really struck me, and it struck me all the way through the historical record in North Baffin, that when you come to some of the things like Ikuma's going up to heaven and proclaiming the message that she got from heaven, that there's an ongoing riff of Inuit they're always trying to take back control over this Christianity thing. They're trying to take back control for themselves and wrest control away from the missionaries. Certainly when you get into that later period. And that this is a hugely political, anti-colonial stance where they are trying to assert that kind of thing. Of course, it gets into even more of a mess every time those things happen. And then, reflecting on my time in Arctic Bay, began to think about, well, why were these people so dedicated and committed? Why even, 30 years after Jack Turner has died, they're still driving this thing forward on their own, and they're really not interested in having any white missionary participate in this. So it left me with, and so all I wrote on it at the time, I've done a lot of talks about it. All I've written is that article, the Mission and Opposition article, and then the Rapture and the Rupture article, which is the one that deals with the events in 1981 and 1947 and 46, and the connection between the two, and some reflection on that. But I've spent most of my time since then trying to answer the question, so what does this all mean? What is this all about? Why? How does this happen? Frédéric picked up the torch and ran with it. So there is now actually some real data to go with rather than, my speculation. But there are lots of other pieces that I still think need to be thought about and connected in this. We'll talk a little bit more later about working in Pangnirtung, but working in Pangnirtung actually deepened this issue. And talking to the folks in Pangnirtung now, the advantage or the thing about Pangnirtung is that's where the first missions were established in Baffin Island in 1894 under Edmund Peck. So that's the sort of epicenter, if I can put it that way, of at least the introduction of Christianity into Baffin Island. I know that there are other centers. I actually did make a pilgrimage to Umanagjuak, to Blacklead Island. I convinced my friend Jaco that I really, really wanted to go there and actually see this place. So I've actually been there and walked the ground where Peck walked. It wasn't that deeply a spiritual experience, but anyways, one of the things that came out is I went to see my friend Elizabeth Shulutuk one day. Elizabeth Shulutuk is a extremely well-known artist from Pangatok. She does all kinds of narrative stories. Anyway, I went to see Elizabeth and I walked in and she said to me, "Have you got any cigarettes, Chris?" Well, I only had 4 or 5 left. And I said, "No, this is all I've got." "Oh, that's not good enough." She threw me her sketch pad and said, $50, you can have any sketch you want out of the pad, but give me the $50 because I got to go get cigarettes. So I gave her the 50. I happen to have $50, which is pretty rare. I gave her the $50, and she goes off out the door to buy cigarettes, and I get to choose whatever I want out of this sketch pad. I was going to bring it, but unfortunately it's framed, so I couldn't carry it. But so I find this sketch in there, which has a picture of a group of Inuit sitting in a circle around. There's a cross in the middle with a bird sitting on top of the cross, and Inuit in various stances, postures of worship and praise in a circle around that. Right up my alley. I thought, this is perfect. That's exactly what I want. So that's the picture that I chose and I took for my $50. And but there are a lot of things about that picture. I asked Elizabeth about it. I said, is this depicting a particular event? "Oh, no, I just made that up." I said, is it in a particular place? "Oh, no, I just drew sort of an imaginary place." "Oh, okay." Well, interestingly, when I showed the picture to other Inuit, they all looked at it and they said, "Oh, that's Umanagjuak." They recognized it. The way she'd shaped the hill in the picture is the hill at Umanagjuak. And they all immediately said, "That's Umanagjuak." And I thought, I wonder, I have to be skeptical sometimes and I thought, I wonder if there is an event behind this. There's something that certainly we've never recorded anything. We've never had a narrative that tells us about any kind of ecstatic Inuit-run religious events that took place in Umanagjuak. But this makes me very suspicious that there's another whole layer in there that we aren't getting. The other thing that, of course, that struck me is the bird sitting on top of the cross. The bird is a classic shamanic symbol, and it's also a symbol for the Holy Spirit, I know, but this was not a dove. It wasn't a loon either. But it's a classic shamanic symbol, and I'm thinking, there's just one of those very subtle references in this that there's a shamanic referent in here that is not stated, but it's just very subtly just kind of referenced at the top of the cross, which is kind of interesting. But what struck me again was the sort of the depth of engagement and how much of this story we don't know about it. I just wanted to add one little piece, and I think we can get this in here, is in part of a project that I did with the family of Jack and Arthur Turner. We took 2 elderly women from Pangatok to England to meet with the Turner family and to work with the Turner family. And so it was quite an experience taking these, Evie was 80 and Rosie was 76, to England for the first time. And but I remember, of course, our English friends wanted to show them all the great houses and cathedrals and castles of England, which meant absolutely nothing to them. I mean, the history meant nothing to these Inuit, and so our host eventually said to what are they interested in? What can we take them to see? I said, well, how about we take them to see is there a petting farm or a petting zoo? Animals nearby. Can we? Is there? Yes, there was a petting farm, and I remember walking in there with Evie, and there was a pen of goats and a pen of sheep, and Evie just stopped dead in her feet. She's 80 years old. She's been reading the Bible since she could read, right, since she was born. She stopped dead in her tracks and said, Chris, I get it. I said, what do you get? She said, I've never seen a sheep before. This is the first time I've seen a sheep. And I've never seen a goat before. This is the first time I've seen a goat. I now get all those stories. And I'm thinking, okay, 80 years of sheep and goat stories. And she gets it now, right? So, to put it the other way around, what the hell was she thinking about for the previous 80 years? Like, what did she understand out of these stories all of that time? And she's listened to them. She's heard them more times than I have. But that was the moment. I got it. I understand. It actually was kind of funny because I actually got into the pen with the goats, and the goats stole the food from me, and then the goats were I was chasing the goat around the pen, and they were chasing me around the pen trying to get the food back. And of course the goat story in the Bible became even more clear to her as we tried to understand what was going on with these goats. What is going on? I mean, I know what's going on with me chasing goats, but what is the thinking that's been there all this time? And I don't think we've got at that yet. There's something that they're seeing, hearing, understanding. The metaphors don't mean anything. So what is it? And to me, that's a very hard question to answer. Maybe it can't even be answered. But I think it asks us to think about it in a very different way, in a much more interesting way to reflect on. So that takes you into the sort of my thinking about the missions, but certainly doesn't give any answers on it.